Black Invisibility, set in early 20th century Harlem for the most part, and just a, an incredibly perceptive and deeply critical analysis about race, both in terms of the ways that that the broader society seems oblivious to the humanity, frankly, of Black folks, and then the ways that oftentimes Blacks, in response to that, will move into kind of an underground approach to that very society. So I mean, it's this kind of two-way dynamic that's taking place in the novel. But I want to start off with just a quick excerpt from the book that helps to kind of, in fact, a couple of short excerpts from the book that kind of help set the tone of what Ellison is conveying through this incredible novel. So he writes at one point in the book, and this is now speaking in the voice of the protagonist, who, by the way, is never named. The protagonist has no name in this book. It's just he's speaking. You're seeing the world through his experience and through his eyes, but you have no name for this person. So the protagonist states, "I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me." He goes on to say, "I was, and yet I was invisible. I was, and yet I was unseen." So that's getting at this whole issue of the way that blacks are rendered invisible, and then at one point in the novel, the protagonist is shouting to others, look at me." And it's interesting to note that this act of frustration on the part of the protagonist was directed not at persons predisposed toward ignoring him, meaning the kind of stubbornly oblivious majority. Instead, the protagonist's frustration was directed at a group of activists claiming to be in solidarity with him. Specifically, these were revolutionary socialists attempting to organize blacks within the book's early 20th century Harlem setting. And so the protagonist is shouting at them, look at me, look at me. Everywhere I've turned, somebody has wanted to sacrifice me for my good. Only they were the ones who benefited. So these are degrees of unseeing, right? Degrees of unseeing. Sometimes being, with blacks, sometimes being rendered invisible in the most frustrating ways when by their supposed allies who prove incapable of seeing them. So so Ellison gives us this powerful language and imagery around invisibility, and I want to kind of place before us some ways to probe this, to look at this more fully. Starting maybe by asking, what does Black invisibility mean within our present context? What has been rendered invisible? What is it we've proven incapable of fully seeing? Has it been an inability to see Black humanity in and of itself? An inability to see the racial injustices surrounding our relationships? An inability to see a justifiable Black rage about these matters? It's probably been all of those things. Um, but it's probably situated and sort of emanating out of that first one. I mean, our inability to even recognize fully each other's humanity, right? And Black humanity in particular here in this instances. So rather than us being able to recognize Black humanity, we engage in a more kind of routine Black objectification. Rather than acknowledging racial injustice, we're blind to racial injustices. Rather than embracing the justifiability of Black rage, we show irritation and opposition toward Black rage. So we're left with this dilemma. And so I want to keep putting some things on the table here just to as backdrop to what can be further discussion here. And I want to take us from Ralph Ellison to the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so I want to pull on a scriptural passage here that I think in many ways illustrates powerfully what Ellison is trying to get at with the novel. And it's Mark chapter 8. And it's verses 22 through 25 of Mark chapter 8. If you feel free to turn to that passage if you have your scripture, your Bible handy, but I'll read it for you here and then say a few things about this brief passage. That's Mark 8, 22 through 25. The passage reads this way. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Interesting passage. Well, one thing that's very instructive in this passage is that this was a person who was divinely touched, but who remained unable to see people in the fullness of their humanity. So this is a message to church folks, right? It's a message to church folks, those of us who say we've been touched, but we still can't see each other clearly. And in this passage, what's also instructive is that a second touch was required. Now, a very unusual passage within all the gospel passages, all the accounts of Jesus's miracles, right? It never took a double action on the part of Jesus to kind of get the result that we can sort of be that could serve as our takeaway, right? In this instance, it took a double action. Jesus had to touch this man twice. And what I want to suggest here is that second touch really amounted to a testing of this person's perception, right? It was a testing of perception. What do you see? Jesus asked the man. And I think about so this week I actually had to go for my annual eye examination, um, and eye examinations are a kind of interrogation, right? It's an interrogation. You show up and they put you behind these machines, these lenses. They keep switching lenses and they're testing how well you can see. And specifically, you're looking at a chart and they want to ask you how far down the chart can you see? How deeply can you see into this chart? How many fine details can you really see on this chart? Our conventional religious lenses seem to have proven insufficient for perceiving each other's humanity, for being able to sort of see deeply and fully into each other's experience. We require another kind of vantage point, it seems, another perspective, a different training of our eyes, a different training of our eyes in order to be able to sort of read the fine details of each other's experience. And I think part of this has to do with where we locate, right? Where we locate. So, what's our proximity to others? What's our distance from others? Our distance vision has proven inadequate, right, for being able to see each other. We can't content ourselves with distant vision, with a kind of telescopic vision. We're certain to miss the essential things about each other by relying upon telescopic, long distance vision. We need to locate more closely. We need to be able to see each other close up. We need microscopic vision, the kind that comes from deep engagement, deep immersion with each other, with the other. To get my eyes examined, I couldn't do that from home. I needed to show up at the optometrist office and submit to the paces that the optometrist wanted to take me through. So 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 and frankly, I delayed, right? I delayed my annual exam, but I mean, I hadn't shown up for an exam for 2 or 3 years, and it was only when I began to have trouble seeing my computer screen that I finally showed up for the eye exam. So there's a lot of things that were going on in that instance. Um, in order for me to have my perceptions kind of vetted and tested, I had to relocate to submit to a kind of interrogational process, a kind of testing process. I had to show up in another kind of place to get another kind of vantage point. And the only reason that I would do that was because my usual pattern was being disrupted. And so the second touch in this passage, right? This second touch is the key, I think, right? It's the key to being able to advance in our perceptual capacities. The second touch is about disruption and relocation. Until we're like placed in a situation of dis-ease, unease, we're probably going to stick with our normal patterns, no matter how blurred our perceptions may be, right? We have to get to the point where our vision is so compromised and so recognizable from from our own vantage point that we know we have to do something about it. And then we do get up and do something. We take a step to submit to some sort of a process for testing and interrogating our positioning, how we're seeing the world around us. Now, so that relocation can take several forms, and that interrogation can take several forms. But it strikes me that it requires some sort of a process, submitting to some sort of a process that takes us beyond our normal routine. Maybe that's an educational process. Maybe that's the ways that we are challenged within our church context through the scriptures, through liturgical liturgical dimensions of worship, but through our prayer gatherings, through conversations, structured conversations with the pastor, through community meetings and community engagement, where we're hearing from other people about their experiences, what's taking place outside our own experience, outside our church walls, outside our home life, outside our social locations. So some sort of a process that interrogates our assumptions and our positioning. And probably to get to that process is going to require some sort of a relocation. Okay, so I've said a lot here, and so it kind of comes down to some questions of, you know, what at what point do we acknowledge that we're not seeing clearly enough? At what point do we acknowledge we're not seeing clearly enough? So to get back to Ellison here, just briefly, it was these community organizers, these sort of supposed allies, these revolutionary types coming into Harlem that generated the most frustration on the part of the protagonist, because they presumed to be aligned with the struggle of these folks, but were unable to really see their struggle at all. And were really just trying to manipulate and use the situation to their own benefit. Uh, the Mark passage: the blind man gets touched, presumes to have sight, but the test was he still couldn't see people clearly. So it's at what point do we acknowledge that we're not seeing clearly enough? And then at what point do we finally show up to that relocation? You know, at what point do we submit to a relocation? And what is that place to which we show up? I mean, so let me just leave those kind of questions here hanging, and place those on the table. I can say some more specifically about, and maybe we can come back to this part, loop back through it. I mean, I've got some data that can help us kind of place some quantitative points around the progress, the movement that we have experienced nationally in some of our perceptions on race. We can either put some of that on the table now, pause here and have some discussion, come back to that, or not even really deal with the data. Let's just deal with what's on the table. I'll just leave it to you at this point, but let me pause here and invite some more process things going on here.
I have a question. In your analogy with the going to the eye doctor, where is that eye doctor, and how do we know we need to go to him or her? It's a conundrum, because you think you can see and you can't, and how do you know you can't? And then what is it, or where is it, or who is it that you go to discover that you can't, and get the right kind of lenses?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the challenge, I think, that's before all of us. And again, I'd want to suggest that probably none of us in our various blindnesses, race is not the only blindness from which we suffer. I mean, one of the issues I spend a lot of time talking about is our inability to see the situation of the poor, impoverished folks. So we don't see them. I spend a lot of time on that issue, more than I spend on race. Those two are connected. I mean, there's a symbiosis often between those two, but they're not the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing, and they don't always correspond, right? So I mean, we got poor white folks and we've got wealthy black folks. So those things aren't always the same thing. So yeah, I think that it starts. I think it always has to start with that disruption. until there's a disruption, human nature is that we remain in our comfort zones. Now, how those disruptions take place, they change from time to time. I mean, disruptions occur in all sorts of ways. When we look at the last few months, there have been some major disruptions. The kind of younger generation protest in response to the George Floyd killing, that was disruptive for the broader society in some new ways. I mean, we've had plenty of street level protests before in response to these very same activities, the killings, the unjust killings of Black folks by police. Now, we've had protests before, but there was something about this one that, first of all, led to a greater scale of protests. I mean, these protests were taking place not only in Minneapolis, and they were huge in Minneapolis, and not just for a day or two, but in a protracted way. But these protests were taking place around the country and around the world. There were Black Lives Matter protests taking place across the European continent, Australia, other parts of the South Pacific and Asia, across the African continent, the Latin American context. These were global protests. And it could be that the scale of the protest led to a moving of the needle within our own context, within the US, within the authority structures, within our institutional sectors within the US. A moving of the needle that simply just hadn't happened before, at least not in these ways. And we could look at, I mean, we could talk about various sectors. I mean, I'm in the educational sector, obviously, and I've seen some dramatic things happening within the educational sector, higher education in particular. I mean, there's literally a movement of sorts taking place within higher education around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You have all these higher education institutions that are implementing a diversity, equity, and inclusion process, hiring vice presidents and vice provosts for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, this is taking place at a fairly sizable level, right? Now this is happening. It's just happening in the last few months. Why didn't it happen before? Why is it only happening now? Why are institutions that have less than 5% Black student body, less than 5% Black faculty, who have curriculums that are very colonial, why is this only happening in the last few months? Well, I mean, maybe it was the size of the disruption.
Mhm.
One other quick point on this. One of my dissertation advisors at Yale, Dick, I don't know if you ever had a chance to take any political science courses while you were there, or to even attend any of the lectures downtown, as we say, right? Rogers Smith was one of the political science professors at Yale. And he wrote, among other things, I mean, he's now at University of Pennsylvania. I think he's about ready to retire, University of Pennsylvania Political Science Department. But one of the books that he wrote was a book called The Unsteady March. Fascinating book, very eloquent and just well analyzed book, where he's really focusing on the fact that significant advances in racial progress within the US only occurred just after US involvement in major wars. So after the Civil War, there was this major kind of advance. After World War I, a major advance. After World War II, a major advance. After the Korean War, a major advance, and so forth, right? And it was because those wars were disruptive of business as usual within the American context. Very disruptive in all sorts of ways. It created a certain kind of exit of certain power configuration. So white males were shipped off in large numbers to fight wars, taken out of the day-to-day structurings and configurations of American society, opening those up to some new dynamics. So there was an exit aspect, and there was an entrance aspect. Women, African Americans, other people of color found now opportunity and room to engage in employment sectors where that had been closed previously, to enter into other aspects of American society from which they had been previously blocked. So there was a whole disruption that took place around that. So anyway, enough said about the disruptive aspect.
Drew, I wonder if you have gotten an advance copy of today's Columbus Dispatch, because I have an opinion piece in there that talks about pandemic as an epochal shift, of epoch. And I was only given 500 words for the article. I can't clear my, folks know I can't clear my throat in less than 800 words. So
Exactly right.
I couldn't do what you were doing, but I think that's an end this kind of aspect to it.
Absolutely.
I want to say a word about your method. I'm glad you revealed yourself as a member of the Political Science Guild. That's your world. You're also a Baptist preacher, and you came out of the deep Baptist roots when you and I met on the hardwood 40 some years ago, and you retain your devotion to the church. It's clear, and your teaching with Mark's Gospel is very helpful to us. But your method, in a book that you co-edited some years ago called Black Churches and Local Politics, your method is revealed, where you end your essay by saying, there is a pragmatism that has guided African-American politics, captured in the motto of the Congressional Black Caucus, and perhaps usefully applied to Black churches. Quote, we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. That kind of pragmatism, I think, is at the heart of a shared reckoning that we have. I hope and pray that, like our encounter at the milk station at the refectory at Yale Divinity School, we have a shared reckoning and a shared encounter. I learned much from you, and I hope that that day was a day of some kind of learning back and forth at that table. But it's not sort of, oh, now we've done our reckoning, there are no differences anymore. We're all permanent allies forever and ever, amen.
Right.
I think there's a sense that we always have to be clear about our interests. Can you say a little bit more, coming from your work now at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary as the head of the Metro Urban Institute, of what, 30 years, that program? You haven't been there 30 years, but it's
No, I've not been there 30 years, but the program has been around 30 years now.
I mean, that's a long time for an institute like that. That's a very, you've dealt with Rodney. You probably came alive about the time of Rodney King and the disturbance in South Central LA.
Exactly right.
So what about interests a little bit? I'm curious.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dick. All of that you just said there, including drawing attention back to some of the writings that I've done in the past. And this also still segues with Missy's question. So what is that way then that we subject ourselves to a testing process and interrogation? Well, yeah, there's an immersive dimension. I want to get back to that immersive dimension. I don't think that we can do this. This is not a distance learning proposition. This is about being embedded, not only engaged. I have a whole analysis that I do, sort of a model that sort of traces from enclave to engagement to embeddedness. Enclave being sort of that bounded, separate sort of self. Engagement is when we sort of move outside those boundaries and interact. But embeddedness is when we're like all the way in to the point of sort of sacrificial relationality, right? So most of us don't get to that embeddedness place. We at best we may be engaged, that can be temporary. It can still be fairly remote, but it's engaged. It's at least taking us outside the boundaries. For me, the issue is about being immersed, and it's about being contextual. So a big emphasis that I've had in my scholarship, in my teaching, has been around a kind of contextual analysis that comes through being deeply immersed, deeply engaged, and entering into the other's vantage point as best we can. Because I mean, we're still outsiders in many instances from the other, whoever the other is. We're still outsiders. But how do we submit to a discipline of immersion, of deep immersion, where as best we can disentangle from our own rootedness in our experience, our personal subjective experiences, and more fully enter into the experience of the others. Dick, you may recall that I've got a long history with kind of global voluntarism. So right after graduating from Yale Divinity School, you may recall I kind of shipped off, Angelique and I both shipped off for a whole summer experience, voluntary experience in Africa through Operation Crossroads Africa. And then both of us were very involved with that organization for years and still are. I mean, I became the deputy director of that Africa volunteer program shortly after my first volunteer years there. And we remain deeply involved with that whole model, that whole principle of sort of getting up, moving outside of our everyday experience, and just fully plopping down in the experience of the other. And it was not always comfortable. In fact, it was very uncomfortable. That unfamiliarity, that unknowing. I mean, that's an uncomfortable situation. So the immersive aspect has been very important. But then that sort of broader discipline of contextualizing our analysis. I mean, I teach contextual analysis at the seminary. I do contextual analysis in my research and writing. That means that you're you're looking for ways to really hear from the other in a disciplined, systematic way. You structure a methodology of hearing, listening, seeing, observing, and we can do that all kinds of ways. You know, we make sure that as a congregation, that you got a discipline of entering into conversation with the communities outside your walls, and entering in from a listening and observing standpoint. You know, not from a kind of being in charge standpoint, but a coming alongside, listening, observing carefully, testing your observations. One of the last thing I'll say, Dick, and one of the big projects that I had was a project about 20 years ago now, funded project where I looked at the relationships, the interactions between congregations and low-income public housing residents in 4 cities across the US. Surveyed about 1,200 public housing residents, knocked on doors, surveyed 1,200 residents, surveyed the pastors of about 150 churches within a mile radius of those public housing complexes, asked all sorts of questions about their interactions with one another. But after we gathered the survey data, we convened day-long roundtable discussions in each of those cities where we tested our observations with the people, with representatives from the public housing complexes, representatives from the clergy groups. Here's what we picked up on in the surveys and the interviews. Does this ring true? Do the relationships that we've uncovered here ring true to your experience? And then use that as a prompt for conversation. Point being, it was a disciplined process where we went out and carefully and systematically listened and observed, and then tested those observations. That's a kind of process that can be applied and adapted to perhaps many of the things that we do. Again, in response to your question, Missy.
So Trinity, needs you. And I'm not suggesting you rush and become an Episcopal priest so you can become the 25th rector, but Trinity needs you. And I hope that you'll be open to Trinity's leaders coming to you in the next 6 months or so to talk about process like that as they think about asking those questions that will make this interim time and this search time after 25 years. I'm in my 24th year, long
Wow.
past.
That's wonderful.
Lot of good. But one of the things they would have taught us, Leon Watts and Kelly Clark in that class that we took together,
Exactly.
would say it's not all good to have somebody around for 24 years.
Mm.
You're going to have some talk about, what did you call it? A shock to the system, a
Disruption.
Disruption. Yeah. You know, I mean, thanks be to God. And I'm not saying that from Catherine and me. We love this place. But thanks be to God for Trinity, for that disruption. And the Holy Spirit will be alive and well in that process. But I think the discipline you talk about could be very helpful. So I'm intruding in talking about what happens after June 1st around this place. So forgive me for that, wardens. But you know, I think Drew Smith and this kind of work is about racial reckoning and equity for sure. But it's also helpful to a congregation that wants to really be, as we say on the door, a house of prayer for all people.
Mm.
Great congregation, much like Christ Church Cathedral downtown Indianapolis, with about $900 million less than what they have, or whatever it is. We don't have any Eli Lilly money, but you know, but I mean, it's very similar situation with the same kinds of history of sort of, hey, we're here and we're going to tell you all what, you know, what's going to happen in this city. And it ain't like that anymore. So I really think we are raising some important points for our method, for our process. Thank you.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I'm done, Stacy.
Yeah, I probably talked too long. I didn't give people a chance to really really discuss. But as you indicated earlier, Dick, we're both preachers, and I'm a Baptist preacher. It takes me an hour just to get going good.
Great. Well, we are at the end of our time. This has been recorded, so we will upload this to our website. If there's things that we want to circle back to, or individuals to share it with who weren't with us today. So Dr. Smith, it has been an absolute honor to have you with us today, and you are always welcome at Trinity.
Thank you. It's been great to be here, and all the best to Trinity at this moment in this ministry, with all that means.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye. God bless.